Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me? We good? All right, good. Well, my name's Harold. I'm an alcoholic. It's great to be with you. I am from St. Louis, Missouri, Big Mo. It's still Chiefs Nation, Chiefs Kingdom over here, so Carlo will like that. She's happy. She's representing today. My sobriety date's April 7th, 1987, and my home group is AA on the Rocks. We meet in St. Louis on Wednesday nights in the Shaw neighborhood, which is South City, St. Louis, down in the city. Strong Free Legacy group. I'm excited to be a member of that group, and I'll be there tonight. And so if you ever come to St. Louis and you happen to be here during the middle of the week, I'd love for you to come to On the Rocks. And if you get a hold of me early enough, I will put you to work. We will find some way to get some mileage out of you. I can promise you, and have a good time doing it. So, but anyway, happy birthday to birthday people. And 41 years with Elizabeth. That's fantastic. It's a long time not to be dancing with John Barleycorn, that's for sure. So, but it's great to be here. And Glenn, thank you. Glenn's just a solid example for me, and in trudging the road, and especially during this virtual transition we had during COVID-19. So many of us together today that would never be here if it wasn't for the pandemic. So what was disastrous for many of us, we all lost people that we loved during this pandemic, but at the same time, there's been a lot of blessings that came out of it and bringing a lot of people together that normally wouldn't mix. And just think about the next international conference. When you go to the next international, if you happen to go to that, and you start to see some of your friends that you've made across the water or whatever, on these platforms, you get to see them live, maybe for the first time. It'll be an experience that you don't want to miss, I'm sure. But I'm glad to be here, and as soon as I'm done speaking here, I have to bounce to go to speak at a different event. But I am privileged to be here, and in Alcoholics Anonymous, I'm as busy today and as active today in Alcoholics Anonymous as I've been in my entire sobriety. And so it's been good to me and good for me. I came to AA for the first time in 1979. I came to AA through the Department of Corrections. I came out of Boonville Correctional Center and was brought back to Northern Missouri and arrested on another charge that was pending. They were just waiting to pick it up. And so while I was in that detention center being held for that, a couple of guys brought AA in. It was 1979. I was far from conceding that I was powerless over alcohol, but it was an adequate demonstration of AA. And I think it's on page 105 of Bill Sees It, and I'm paraphrasing here. But at the middle of the way down that page, it's titled Our Chief Responsibility, and it's an excerpt from one of his letters from in the 40s. And it goes on to say, again, I'm paraphrasing, it says, our chief responsibility is to deliver an adequate demonstration of Alcoholics Anonymous to the newcomer. And that's important, I think, as an individual, as a group, as a district, as an area, as AA as a whole, whether we're virtual, whether we're in person, it doesn't matter. I mean, to have an adequate demonstration is imperative. I take it very seriously today. I didn't necessarily at the beginning because I was so broken, but I do today. And I'm forever grateful for it, because the early experiences with Alcoholics Anonymous were adequate demonstrations. Even though I didn't want what you had to offer, I wasn't close to conceding I was powerless over alcohol. But the demonstration was well received and memorable enough that I came back to it eventually. But that's where I was introduced. I bailed out on that charge, and when I was on bail, the prosecutor and my parole officer came to me and said, "Look, we want to give you an opportunity here. You can go into treatment for 30 days, or you can go back to Boonville Correctional Center for 2.5 years. That's your options." Now, I quit school when I was 13, but I had enough math to know that 30 days was a heck of a lot shorter than 2.5 years. So I took the plea bargain, went to treatment for the first time in 1980, the early part of 1980. And again, at least in Missouri, most of the treatment centers at that point were driven by AA. I mean, most of the members were members of Alcoholics Anonymous. Most of them just used purely the Big Book, the 12 steps, the program of recovery. And that's, you got detox, and you were thrown into some mix of that. And so that's how I was introduced to AA, more in a more formal way in 1980. But I was just so far removed from conceding that I was powerless over alcohol. And it would be 7 years after I left that place that I would ever, walk into or approach the subject of recovery or Alcoholics Anonymous. But I'm grateful for that demonstration that was given to me, because it's where I went back to in 1987. In the time I have, when I do AA talk, especially anymore, I really try to think, what is the meat? I'm not here to entertain anybody. I'm not here to teach anybody anything. All I'm here is to share experience, strength, and hope. And so what is it I got to share that's relevant, that's meaningful? And so I kind of just shrink it down and I call it the 5 big delusions of alcoholism, although I'm not saying that's all there is. There's many delusions, countless delusions, but I just call them the 5 because it helps me just weave my story between these 5 points, which I think are the most important thing I have to share with you. And so that's what I want to share from today is that context. And so I'm going to talk about the 5 big delusions and then weave my story through it and conclude with the 5th one. But so the first delusion I would call the delusion is that I'm not alcoholic. And I don't know if my screen's going crazy. Let me shut it off for a second and go back on. There it is. Well, on my end, it was going nuts. But I call it this delusion. Number 1 is I'm not alcoholic. And that delusion, wipes out most people. I mean, unfortunately, this illness, if you Google how many alcoholics there are in the world versus how many people estimated in recovery, it's not even close. It's not even a close number. So we're making a dent, we're making an impact, and it's powerful and it's important, but there's still lots of work to be done. But the reason why those numbers are so widened is because of the delusional nature of alcoholism. And, we toss a word around in recovery called denial. But denial is a word you only see mentioned twice in the big book, once in Bill's story and once in the spiritual appendix, and both times talk about denying a power greater than yourself. The way our literature, especially our early writers of the big book, really define alcoholism, this malady, was definitely an element of denial, but it's way past that. They describe it as the basis of delusion and illusion, meaning I can't see myself for what I really am, and I can't differentiate the true from the false. Denial is I know it's over there, I'm just not going to look at it. But delusion means it's staring me right in my face, and I can't see it for what it is. And that's a huge difference, and it's that dilemma, I think, that I suffer from, and I've seen countless other people suffer from, that destroys most alcoholics. That we will, as the book says, page 30, will go to the gates of insanity or death because of this delusion. I'm not what everybody says I am. I'm not what all the evidence says I am. And that's a powerful delusion. And whether it's somebody you love or it's yourself personally, to watch that or be around that or being connected to that, it's very painful, and it's very heart-wrenching to watch somebody burn their life to the ground that has it. But I had it. I had a bad case of it. I was raised by a single mom, a mom who was married to 2 alcoholics in her lifetime. And the first alcoholic marriage was in St. Louis, and she had a son and 2 daughters that came out of that. And the insanity and the madness, who knows how deep and how broad that was, but it was enough to drive her out of that relationship. And for 10 years of her life, she was MIA. My siblings didn't know if she was alive, if she was dead. And 10 years later, she resurfaces on the western side of Missouri on the Kansas-Oklahoma border, and she surfaces in a mental institution, a state-run hospital that's still active there today in Nevada, Missouri, right on the Kansas border. And my mom was just a very broken person, and she got well enough to get out there. She was there for quite some time, from what I understand. But when she got out, she met another alcoholic who happened to be my father. And she got married to him. I came out of that marriage, and somewhere between 2 and 3, my mom just had enough. She was just done with the insanity of it all. Didn't have Al-Anon, didn't have any kind of recovery, was just done. She pushed him out of her life, and she just turned her will and life over to the care of God as she understood God. And she never let off that pedal until the day she died. And she matured and grew and blossomed into being one of the most amazing women that ever lived. And her demonstration and her love for me and for humanity made a huge difference in how my life turned out. She was the greatest winner of my life, and she died in 2015. And we call her Mama Long in recovery program. But Mama Long, she just was done. She was just beat down. She didn't have any resources, didn't have any parents. All of her parents died young. Her parents both, no grandparents. I never knew anybody other than my mother. I knew my dad just a very little bit, especially at the young age. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But this is it. I was raised by this mom who turned her will and life over to her Catholic roots, and she just never wavered. And I don't think there's anything more beautiful in the world than a woman who's walked with God for a long time. And my mother was one of those people, and she was an inspiration to many. But she didn't start out that way. She was very fractured and very broken by all the traits of alcoholism. We lived in a beat-up old house. We shared a bathroom with the lady next door until I was 7 years old. But somewhere right around between age 8 and 9, my mom said, look, we're going to make a shift. We're going to move to St. Louis. And I said, why? And she says, because you got a brother and 2 sisters you don't know about. And that was a huge bombshell for me because I never knew any of that. There's a huge mystery in our life, and all of a sudden she reveals it. And so it made me question a lot of things. But we moved to St. Louis, and so she could reconcile and rebuild or rekindle or attempt to relationships with these children that she just walked away from. And in that 10 years, until the day she died, she would never talk about that 10 years. She was asked many times by myself and siblings. She goes, it's old news. It's my past. I don't want to talk about it. That's the end of it. And that was. I mean, she never talked about it till the day she died. That was her secret that she took to the grave with her. I know it wasn't anything she was proud of, for sure. My mom drank every day till the day she died. She was, I wouldn't call her a hard drinker, definitely not an alcoholic, but definitely somebody who drank alcohol on a pretty regular basis. Whatever the cheapest beer in town was, my mother had it. And she always had a fifth of Old Crow underneath the sink. Some of the old timers call that the dirty bird. My mom always had booze around. She smoked cigarettes at the time. And so that was around me. But when I got to St. Louis, taken out of that small country town, that really protective, small, isolated environment, and thrown into a public school system where I went from maybe 100 kids to thousands, it's where my world changed. It's where where life took on a whole new adventure and a whole new meaning to me. This dilemma, this underlying drive that I think most alcoholics suffer from some, I think all human beings do at some degree, but alcoholics to an extreme level, this imposter narrative, if you would, this delusion, I call it the delusion of inequality, that just who I am at any given moment is not enough, that I'm not what I should be, I'm not what you think I should be, I'm not what society says I should be, and that stigma, that delusional of inequality drove my life to a lot of poor decisions, even into sobriety. It's led to poor decisions because ultimately what you thought of me paralyzed. And I think this is what Bill's describing on page 62 when he says, we're driven by 100 forms of fear. That's what he's getting to. It's just the delusion that just who I am, I'm not enough. And that's a horrible feeling to have. And when it dominates you and it causes you to cave to peer pressure and take on acts that you normally wouldn't take, it leads to a lot of destructive behavior. That's ultimately what it did. My first real drink with King Alcohol came between the age of 10, between 11 and 12 years of age. I grew up on the streets. My mom was never home. She was always working 2 or 3 jobs to keep a roof over her head. And at the age of 10, by the age of 10, I just came and gone as I wanted to. I was a rock and roll drummer. I started playing drums when I was young. I was gifted, so I excelled really fast, and I got invited to a lot of circles, even at a young age, that I didn't have any business being in, with kids much older than I was, in their teens, some in their 20s, even a few in their 30s. And they were all into the stuff of the 70s, sex, the drugs, the rock and roll. So I was introduced to that way of life before I was a teenager. And I know I drank some of my mom's booze, and I know I drank some ultra wine at church. That camera acting stupid again. And I know I did all those things. I don't count any of that as a real first drink for me. This first drink, like I said, came between age 11 and 12. And my buddy Steve, who was a member of our band, lead singer in our band, his parents went to Florida. He's about 17. I'm 11. And I was a drummer in this band. And they invited me to come over and to this party. I'd never been to a party in my life. And I went. And I'll never forget the conversation. He was behind the bar playing at his dad's bar, and he asked me this ultimate question: "What do you drink?" And I had no idea how to answer the question. I just said something to the effect of, "Whatever you're drinking is what I'm drinking." And he made me a big glass of slow gin and Coke. I remember it like it was yesterday. And I went over and sat on the couch, and I was full of fear and curiosity at the same time. And I finally got the courage to take a pull off it, and it tasted like cough syrup. And I said, "Well, it's not a big deal. It tastes like Robitussin." And I took a few more pulls, and I started to get that sensation we get in our body from King Alcohol. And eventually, the effects of alcohol really started to take hold of my life. And I started to get a smile on my face like I never had before. And I drank some more, and the smile got a little bigger. And eventually, the smile wrapped all the way around my head. That's the effect alcohol had on my life. And I didn't necessarily say it, but ultimately, I just planted a flag. Right at that moment, I planted that flag and said, "I'm going to do this for the rest of my life." And I didn't say it that way, but that's ultimately what happened. I turned my will and life over to that way of life. And alcoholism is definitely more than just an allergy, or an obsession. It's a way of life, and it's carried out in many different forms. And I turned my will and life over to it and never looked back until I crashed and burnt my life into the ground. I didn't become an everyday drinker. I got as sick as I've ever been off alcohol that night. I'm sure I lied to my mother that night, and I know I said my first foxhole prayer probably that night. I didn't break the next day, the next week, or the next month. But as a juvenile delinquent, somebody who was totally transformed by that experience, every chance I got to experience that kind of environment and the effect produced by alcohol, I was all about it. And slowly my life changed. We didn't have any money. We didn't have any resources. We just barely got by. And so it led to a life of crime. And I started doing burglaries and hustling and other things I could do to live this lifestyle. And I wasn't good at it. And I got caught for it. And it started me in my journey with the Department of Corrections. It started at the age of 12 and got sent off to a boys' home and ultimately led to juvenile penitentiary system. And it was just on from there. I quit school by the time I was 13. I left home for good when I was 15, and I just hustled my way through life. And I lived all over the South. Lived in Tennessee. I lived in Knoxville for a while. Lived in Nashville. I started out in Austin, Texas, and I finally landed in northern Georgia, Ackworth, Georgia. Charlie Daniels wrote a song called "The Devil Went Down to Georgia Looking for a Soul to Steal." Well, he found me in Ackworth, Georgia. Right in Red Barn Trailer Park. I lived in a beat up old mobile home park with a bunch of reject hillbillies from all over the South. And there wasn't really anybody from Georgia on my street. It was like Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Missouri. And I lived next door to three guys named Pork Chop, Hollywood, and Screwdriver, to give you a real idea how my life was going at the time. But it was there. It was at that space where I had my first real concession, acknowledging that I'm an alcoholic and then I got a problem. Despite all the consequences I've had up to that point and the good teachers and good information and adequate demonstration of recovery, despite all that, as far back as I can remember, this is the first time that I ever had any kind of concession. But when I talk about that delusion of alcoholism, the delusion, number one, that I'm not alcoholic, this is what I'm talking about. This is it. This is, especially if you're newer on here, you might hear somebody describe it as the alcoholic mind or the alcoholic thinking or stinking thinking or whatever, however it's framed. It's referred to in many different ways. But this is what it looks like. And it's so based in delusion. So I woke up on a Saturday morning, Ackworth, Georgia, wintertime, really somewhere right around this time. I had on blue jeans, cowboy boots, a red flannel shirt, and a brown vest. I didn't even make it to my bed that night. I woke up on the trailer floor, and I woke up with a big tomato head. That's what they called a hangover in the South, a tomato head. And I had this big tomato head. And I was a blackout drinker, really from day one. So blacking out was not uncommon. Loved to go to the honky tonks, play music in the honky tonks. I loved the country girls. I loved the cowgirls of the South. And that's just where I lived. I lived in those spaces. But if I was drinking whiskey or mixing booze with anything else, it wasn't uncommon for somebody to want to punch me at least once before the night was out. It didn't happen every time, but it happened enough. And so I woke up on a Saturday morning and I had blood all over me. I had blood over my vest. I had blood over my hands, my blue jeans. And I figured somebody just kicked the hell out of me. And I went into the bathroom to try to figure out what happened to me. And I couldn't really find where I was bleeding from or what had happened. But as I got undressed, I realized somebody sliced me all the way around my arm and they stabbed me in my rib cage. And the challenging part of that whole story isn't really that. As broken and tragic as that is, it's what comes next. And this is when I say that, this delusion of alcoholism, delusion number one, I'm not alcoholic. This is why I think the book says that most people will go to the gates of insanity or death. It's because of what I'm about to describe. So I went out and sat down on the front porch of this trailer. I got highly emotional. I was scared to death because I couldn't recall what happened. But I was just also grieving my life. My life sucked. And I was it had always sucked, really. And here I am in the shambles, and I've got tears in my eyes. I'm as emotional as I've ever been, and I'm mumbling something to the effect, "Man, I got to do something different than I'm doing. I got to do something different." And I'm telling you, it was just, our early authors, they took King Alcohol, they personified it, they gave an old British character named John Barleycorn, and just really personified alcoholism. I've always been able to relate to that, and it was just like King Alcohol was sitting right next to me with his arm around. And this is kind of how the conversation went. I'm mumbling something to the effect, "I got to do something different than what I'm doing." And John Barleycorn's going, "You know what, kid, you're right. You do need to do something different. But before you do anything drastic, go in here and grab your old army jacket, and let's walk up here to the Magic Market and get a quart of beer and a pack of smokes." And that sounded like a really refreshing idea. And anybody on the outside would say that's totally nuts, but it made sense at the moment. And I went and got the Army jacket. I didn't even wash the blood off my hands. I started my little journey up to the magic market. And our book describes that sense of ease and comfort that comes over. So that was coming over me before I ever got there. I was already starting to feel better before I ever got there. And I got the cigarettes, and I got the bottle of booze. I come out, I twisted that cap, made that noise we love to hear, and a spirit come out of the bottle. I took a mighty pull off it, made that face we always make. Man, that would be the last time I thought about not drinking for a long time. And that's alcoholism. And if you got it, it's a deadly game. The good news is, really, it's the best news ever. You can overcome it, but you got to follow a few simple rules. And number one is you got to concede you're powerless over alcohol. Nobody can do that for you but you. I wasn't ready to concede that, and I hitchhiked to Marietta, Georgia. I got sewed up, and it would be over 2 years later before I finally addressed recovery again. I came back to St. Louis in 1985. I got arrested for 4 DWI. A few weeks later, I was playing music across the river from St. Louis in East St. Louis, Illinois. There's where all the bars and strip clubs are at. Rock and roll bars were there. And I was coming home from one of the rock and roll bars with my bandmates. I'm in the back seat of a car. We get into an altercation on the highway that night with another group of people in another vehicle. And long story short, before it was all over with, there was a major accident, and everybody in that vehicle was killed in the other vehicle. And so by the time I got home from that accident, which is way after the sun came up, I walked in my beat up old apartment in St. Louis. I was just a crushed human being. It was like somebody took out my soul and chopped it in half. But the problem was there was nothing between me and John Barleycorn. There was nothing to get between me and his influence. And I call him the great compromiser. And really, within no time at all, being home from a tragic fatality, multi-fatality drunk driving accident, I'm already in the beer, cracking the top on another beer, trying to make the pain go away, trying to find some relief and make sense out of all that, only to get behind the wheel of a car a few weeks later and get arrested for a 50 WI conviction, which were felonies for me, parole violation, 21 going on 22, and I'm on my way back to the penitentiary. And that's delusion number one. I'm alcoholic, and I can't see it for what it is. But in that cell, in that jail cell, I weighed 140 pounds tops. I was isolated by myself, quarantined, in my underwear. They had the air conditioner on. It was cold. But I got out on my knees in that cell. I'll never forget it. And I said the most honest prayer I've ever said in my life. I don't even know if I said please, to be totally transparent. I just know I said, God, help me. But from that moment till now, almost 36 years later, I've never found it necessary to pick up a drink. And the difference between that prayer and all the plea bargain prayers, and Lord knows I said many, was this one was honest. In the chapter of We Agnostics, in more than one space, says that God doesn't make too hard a turn for those who honestly seek God. And I didn't know what I was seeking. I just knew I was done. And what I ultimately did is I surrendered to the enemy being King Alcohol that day. I didn't surrender my will and life over to the care of God. It was a beginning, but it wasn't a full surrender by no means. But I bailed out, and I went all the way back to northern Missouri, about 2.5 hours from here. And I checked myself back in that same treatment center I was at in 1980. There's a lot of treatment centers in St. Louis. I didn't have any relationship with any of them, but that's where that adequate demonstration was given to me. And that's why I pound that drum about the adequate demonstration, because it's so powerful and so meaningful. And I went back there. I didn't go there to go to AA. I didn't go there to get sober necessarily. I went there because it was a place I was familiar with, I was comfortable with, I had enough confidence in it to go there. And I went there because I needed something for the judge. I needed to be able to stand up in front of the courts and say, I'm trying. I'm taking some responsibility for my life. That was my pure motivation for going there. I got 12-step by a guy while I was there who had 2.5 months of sobriety. He just came out of that treatment center, and he befriended me, and he didn't come there to get me to work steps or to be my sponsor. He was just one alcoholic talking to another one. And if it wasn't for that guy, I wouldn't be talking to you today. And so I think it's just an important lesson that we always got to remember that it was Ebby who went to Bill, it was Bill who went to Bob, and it was Gary who went to Harold. And that's a really important lesson for me still today, to know that I'm to take the lead on this 12-step work. And so he stayed with me. I came back to St. Louis, and I didn't go to AA. I didn't go to AA because I didn't want to be an alcoholic. And I didn't want to be consigned to meetings, and I didn't want the idea of not drinking. My even after 30 days of treatment, my definition of sobriety was just simply not drinking. And it just nothing about that got me excited. Like, Glenn, what are you going to do all week? Well, sit around and not drink. Harold, how about you? I'm just going to sit around and not drink. Why don't we get together and we'll just sit around and not drink together? I mean, that was kind of the mindset. It sounded boring. Now I'm just 22 years old. So now I got the rest of my life to sit around and not drink. Nothing about that got me excited. So I didn't go to AA. But my persistent friend Gary kept calling me, Harold, you need to go to AA. And as much as I didn't want that to be true, I knew it was true. And he would say things like, Harold, your life depends on it. And I really didn't want it to depend on it. But I had enough truth in me that I knew that was a true statement. I was powerless enough. I had conceded enough to know that was true. So I finally got the confidence to go to AA. But I came into AA the same way I did everything else in my life, my whole life, on self-propulsion. I'm going to do what I want, when I want, how I want, the way I want. If you don't like it, too bad for you. Because that's just how I fly. And I'm definitely not interested in a sponsor. I've had probation and parole officers or people in that authority position tell me what to do since I was 11. And I'm sure not interested in just giving that to somebody else because I've already still on parole. And now you want me to add somebody else in my life, tell me when to come, when to go, when to call, what to do. I'm not interested. So I just came and I fell in love with the people, fell in love with you guys. And I used my gifts. I started a sober band. I started playing a lot of sober gigs and played on sober softball teams and did all the stuff. But the reality was I was on step none for almost the first 3 years I was here. If you were at the last international in Georgia on Friday night, I forget who spoke on Friday night, but they made this statement. One of the speakers made this statement on Friday night. They said, I did everything right in AA, but 12 things. And I started laughing because that's really my story. I did everything right but 12 things. And so I was able to just hang around. And that's really all I did. I just hanged around. But what I can tell you, especially if you're new, my life didn't completely become transformed as a result of going to these meetings. Meetings are highly important for accountability, for motivation, inspiration, for knowledge, and all kinds of things. But it's the steps that really unclog this channel, if you would. There's a channel between me and this power we talked about. It was completely clogged, and it had been clogged my whole life, long before I ever took a drink. And so the possibility to tap into this power, this had to be dealt with. And the steps are that solution. That's the pathway. That's the design for living that really works if you work it. But looking at the steps face value with from a set of lenses that was very individualistic, very full of consumerism and materialism and secularism, I just couldn't see how that was going to change my life. And the late Clancy would always say, and he said it well, that the hardest thing for anybody to do in recovery, and I believe it's Al-Anon, Alateen, period, the hardest thing for any of us ever to do is to take actions we don't believe in. And I did not believe that 12 steps would change my life. And it's just really the concrete truth. And being around for almost 36 years now and sponsoring hundreds of guys over that time period, I have never met anybody who's really fully lived in and adopted the 12 steps as a way of life until their life depended on it. And my life didn't depend on it, even though it did. I just didn't see it. That's part of the delusion. But I lasted about 3 years like that. And I finally just crashed and burned emotionally, mentally, spiritually. I was just bankrupt. I hadn't drank in 3 years, but my life hadn't really done anything. It was just stagnant. And at least in those areas, my life was even eroded. And I finally humbled myself to ask a guy to help me. And I went to this guy named Roy, and he knew me my whole sobriety. He was about 11 years sober at the time. And I said, Roy, will you sponsor me? He said, yeah, come to my house. And I went to his house, and I sat down with Roy. And he says, well, Harold, you've been around for almost 3 years now. Tell me about your life. And I just vomited my life out to him. That I'm 21 years old, 22 or 25 by this time, 25 years old. I live up the street from you. That's why I asked you to sponsor me, because I can walk to your house. I live in the basement of an old beat up house up the road. I don't have any education. I don't have a GED. I got a criminal record, and I got a piece of crap car that's held together by bumper stickers that I can't legally drive, but I do anyway. This is where my life was at. And after I got done laying out my big drama and sob story, he said to me what changed my life. He said, Harold, I hear everything that you're sharing. And I'll be honest with you, there's no doubt that you've been dealt a really tough hand in your life. But I hope you're going to hear what I'm going to tell you. And that is simply this. Harold, everything you have in your life, right this second, sitting at my kitchen table, you've attracted to you like a magnet. You've attracted it to you by the person that you've become. And today you're man enough to own that truth it's the day you're on your way to some real change. But until you can own that, this vicious cycle you're on, this blame quest that you're on, you're going to do one or two things. You're going to drink again because you're not happy about your sobriety. I know you don't think so sitting here. You don't have that desire, that obsession in your mind to drink, but trust me, it's coming. Or are you going to do what my dad did? My dad, unfortunately, was an alcoholic who could never get sober, and he ended up taking his life. That's how my dad got a drag addict. He just put it into it all. But you're going to do one of two things. You're either going to grow or you're going to go. And the $1,000,000 question is, what do you want to do? And I didn't want to go. I knew he was going to say, let's really engage the 12 steps. But every fiber of me didn't believe it would change my life. And but I was defeated enough that I was willing to take actions I didn't believe in that ultimately changed my life. And if you're new on here, I hope you hear that. I hope you hear that it's just blockage. It's this blockage that's really the root of it all. And we have to get unclogged. If there's a bridge between us and God and something's blocking the bridge, nothing's getting across the bridge. Nothing. And the steps give us a real practical way that we can agree on spiritually of how to unclog the channel. But I have say so in it. I have to be willing to come all the way in, sit down, and stay with that. And the hardest part is staying with that. But so I started that journey, and it brought me really quick up against what I would call the next 4 delusions. So delusion number 1 is I'm not an alcoholic. Delusion number 2 is I could finally come to the room and say, my name's Harold, I'm an alcoholic, but it's not my fault. Now, I may not say it that way. I may not just be that articulate and just say it's not my fault. But it's this 4th step would say to conclude that others was wrong is about as far as most of us ever got was really my foundation. You know, I had a blame list as long as the Mississippi River, which is pretty long here in my part of the country, of why my life was all jacked up. And a lot of it's justified. You know, by the time I was 13, physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, going down the line, I suffered it all. So I had a lot to hang my hat on that says, you know, I'm this way because of them, because of you. And I could have got a lot of cosigners. And I know there's people listening today that have been stricken by a lot of just trauma, stuff they didn't sign up for, they didn't ask for. And it definitely shaped the outcome of their life in some fashion. But if we're going to be sober, if we're going to be happy, we're going to be joyous, free, and our life become happily useful, useful in this life, we have to get rid of that. And we can't just cross our fingers and hope tomorrow's better than it was today. We have to take work. And once you get the channel unclogged, you address it. Right off the bat in that 4th step, if you're thorough and you're honest, you're going to address this victimization. And when you can toss that card, it's a game changer. It's when your life really takes off. My sponsor, most of my sobriety was Tom I. Some of you knew Tom. Tom's birthday would be tomorrow, Groundhog Day. If he was still alive, he'd have 66 years of sobriety. He passed away September 2nd last year. But he was a major influence in my life. And Tom had this quote. And this is what Tom would say. When preparation meets opportunity and God does the introduction, great things can happen in your life. And the preparation is what the steps help us do. The opportunities come, and especially if you live in the States. I mean, there's opportunity out the wazoo. But being prepared for those opportunities is a whole different story. And if it's inside God's will. And if it is, then great things can happen. And I believe the steps prepare us for those opportunities. And he would also say when God's got work for you to do, the walls come down. It's really spiritual mathematics. 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4 anymore, and the impossible becomes possible. And the steps set that up for us if I'm willing to come all the way in, sit all the way down, and stay with it. And so I started that journey. And so I dealt with that victimization, but it brought me right up against delusion number 3 is I am alcoholic, and I take full responsibility for my life. But man, let's just be real. I burnt too many bridges. I broke too many hearts. It's just too much wreckage to overcome for my life to have any to ever really materialize in anything. If you open up the blinds and you look at the landscape and you see Mount Wreckage back there, it looks like Mount Everest. It's impossible for my life to ever be anything than what it is. And when you're stuck in that, it's powerful and it keeps you enslaved. That's why we have a recidivism rate of 60% plus in most states in the United States. It's why you go into treatment centers like I'll be in later today doing a group. And there'll be people there, this is their 4th treatment center, their 10th treatment center, their 20th treatment center. Because what it leads to is this disposition of discouragement. And when discouragement gets into your soul, you quit, you give up. And the older you are when you come to Alcoholics Anonymous, in age especially, the longer you've been at the drinking game, the more powerful this delusion is. It's really hard to overcome. because left to your own self-reliance. There's no visual, there's no hope that my life's going to be anything other than it is. And so we have to overcome that. And again, the steps help us do that. It's a process, and it didn't happen for me in one big cataclysmic explosion, but it happened. It ultimately happened, and it was a game changer in my life. So if you're stricken with that today, you're listening to that, know that it's real. It seems real. It is your reality, that hopeless state of mind and body, that hopelessness that my life is just never going to amount to anything. But I'm just telling you, if you come all the way and say all we got and stay with this, with a qualified sponsor, walk shoulder to shoulder with them, and allow the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous to help you rediscover life, it will happen for you. I don't care how far down the scale your life has gone. It will happen for you. It happened for me. And I started that journey. It quickly brought me up what I would call delusion number 4. And that is the delusion of spiritual disqualification. God sounded like this to me my first 3 years of sobriety. And we all come into Alcoholics Anonymous with what I would call our box of certainty. We're certain God doesn't exist from an atheistic position. We're certain we come in with it, that God can't be known. We don't know if God is or isn't. We just take a neutral position. Or we come in very religious, that God, this is the way. This is the only way you can know God. This is the only way you can experience God. This is the only way to heaven. Whatever. We have a box of certainty when we get here. And we have it. And God, maybe you could argue politics, but definitely God is one of the only things we put in this box. And I brought that box right into me. Bill Wilson brought the box. If you read Bill's story, you can see how it all happens. Abby shows up, going to give Bill the pitch, starts on his religious rant, as Bill would call it. And the next thing you know, Bill brings out his box and says, hey, I went to the Winchester Cathedral with my grandfather. I know about this Jesus guy, not too closely followed by those who claim him. And he goes on and on and on, unpacking his box of certainty. I'm so certain about this higher power, this God idea. And what's beautiful is Abby finally just pushes the box aside and says, hey, God, let's just put that over there for now. And why don't we just subscribe to the idea that, Bill, why don't you choose your own conception of God? And it's a game changer. It's why we're meeting today, because of that conversation. It's why we have the freedom we have to come to Alcoholics Anonymous with our doubts, with our questions, with our fears, with the mystery, and all the stuff we come here with about this power, about creation, about life, etc. And it's the only place I know, it's the only landscape I know of in the world where we really don't care what it is you got in your box, just come. But all we're asking you to do is take whatever's in your box, just take the box and set it aside and just grab hold of these 3 things. We just want you to be honest. We just want you to be open-minded, and we just want you to be willing on a spiritual level. And if you make that your basis for going through the steps, whatever this higher power experience is, you're just going to meet you on the other side of the steps. And if you're struggling with this whole idea, I just hope you hear that. Just lean into the steps with a sponsor. Start an inventory. Share your entire life story. Start to take ownership for your life. Start to reconcile with your past in steps 8 and 9, and watch what happens. But what happens is this channel is going to get unclogged, and it's going to change your life forever. And it's ultimately what happened for me. And but God sounded like this, and it stayed that way until I started working the steps. And I think it's on page 75 of the Big Book, where it says, and I'm paraphrasing, but it says it's at this stage of our recovery where most members, because they've shared their entire life story, they've taken a thorough and honest look at themselves, and they shared it with another human being, that most people will say, this is my first real spiritual experience. And I think that's true, because we get the channel unclogged for the first time, and the sunlight of the Spirit can shine down on our soul. I would define the soul as being made up of our mind, our will, and our emotions. And we start to heal. So as this process started to happen, my life started to change. And 2 + 2 didn't equal 4 anymore, and the impossible started to become possible. And it's too much to talk about, but I'm just saying, the opportunities came. Opportunities that it's no other doubt that God's fingerprints were all over. Opportunities to get into business that I didn't even qualify to take out the trash and excel and get some initials behind my name. And it took me to my 30s, but I finally hit a wall with that. And it's like, you don't have enough education. You don't even have a GED. You can't go any further with us. And so in my early 30s, I was forced to go back to a community college and try to pass my GED. I was already successful and married and doing well as far as the material world goes, but but I was hit a roadblock, and it took my sponsor and a lot of people to convince me that it wasn't impossible for me to do it. And I went back, I quit school when I was 13, so there was just no way to pass the GED just going and sitting for it. So I took the classes, and I did well enough, and I passed with flying colors. And eventually in my 30s, I went back to college, walked across the stage, got a bachelor's degree, wrote my mom a note, and sent her a bumper sticker, said, hey, your kid made the honor roll. I'm 30-something years sober at this time. Eventually walk across the stage and get a master's degree in business and writing a thesis on starting a business from scratch and selling it. And I've been able to do that not once, but twice, and I'm doing it a third time as we speak. And so so the impossible became possible. And I got a beautiful wife and raised 5 kids. And next week, I'm getting ready to go to Colorado, and we're welcoming into the world our 4th grandchild, little baby Atlas. And what a deal. And my kids, I've grown up here. My kids growing up in here. They never seen this guy ever drink or do anything really destructive in his life. They've had a healthy, vibrant life, and it's been amazing. But it leads lastly to delusion number 5, and that is the delusion that there's no real purpose for my life. We do all this work in recovery, do all this inventory stuff and all this sharing and all this reconciliation stuff in steps 8 and 9. And for what? At the end of the day, what really at the end of the day, why? Because let's look at my life. I broke too many hearts. I burnt too many bridges. And there's just little, what's God going to do with that? And all we talk about is purpose. We read about it today. We read our primary purpose in the preamble. We read our group purpose and our singleness of purpose and our traditions. And then we read about our real purpose in page 77, which is to fit ourselves to be a maximum service to God and the people in our life. And because we're so extremely self-centered, we don't see any value in our life. We're so defeated by life. But if we stay here long enough, we discover that God can do a lot with our brokenness. And even on page 124, it says that we got to cling to the thought that our dark past becomes our greatest asset. And that's really been the truth for me. And so I'll wrap up with this, is that my sponsor said, Harold, there's 2 things you need to do, and you need to do them well. And if you do these 2 things for the rest of your life, you're going to live a storybook life. And you couldn't be more truthful than that. And here's the 2 things. Number 1, you always got to have a new guy you're working with. I don't care where you're at on your journey. You need to, if you don't have a new guy, you're on this journey, you stop what you're doing, you get out your rods, you get out your bait, you go fish where there's fish. And if you live in a place like St. Louis, there's fishing holes everywhere. I'll be in one this afternoon. You got to have that new guy. And page 100, first full paragraph, really probably one of the meatiest, most bold promises there are in the big book. And I'm going to paraphrase it, but that's it, page 100. Some of you know it well. And then lastly, second thing is, I want you to go somewhere once a week where you don't want to end up. And you can pick where that's at, but I just want you committed to going there once a week. And if you do those 2 things for the rest of your life, you're going to have a life beyond your wildest dreams. And friends, that's really been the case. And I've been committed to that. I started out in 1990. I've been sober 3 years at this time. 1990, I started going to the Harbor Light Salvation Army Skid Row mission here in St. Louis on Washington Street. And I went there every Thursday and every Saturday for 3 years. Hardest AA I've ever done in my life. Skid Row mission, homeless shelter, all combined in one. Just some of the most broken people you ever meet in your life. But it helped me so much to deal with so many isms that I didn't ask for, but I have. A lot of phobias I had about people, places, and circumstances that I didn't ask for, but I had them. But this space and this going there once a week really helped me address those things and live through those things. And in 1993, I got a phone call from the guy who says, hey, man, would you be willing to come down and speak at this prison? I started laughing. I said, dude, do you know who you're talking to? And he goes, yeah, I know what I'm talking to. I said, well, man, they're not going to let me come back in the prison system. He goes, no, man, I think you've been off paper long enough. I can get you in. And I got a lot of clout in this particular facility, so I'm pretty sure I could get you in. I said, well, let's just say that's true. I made a pact a long time ago. I ain't never, ever, ever going on that side of the fence for you or anybody else. And I was dead serious about it. He laughed. He says, well, do me a favor. Why don't you run that by your sponsor and give me a call back? And you know how that went. He's like, no, man, you're in it. They'll let you. Well, they let me in. They haven't been kicked me out since. And so that's where I spend every week. I have for almost 30 years now inside a maximum security prison. A couple of them here in the St. Louis area that I visit and been a part of for all those years. And I can sit here for the rest of the week and share with you the blessings that came from that life. And I'm very involved in the treatment center world. That really came out of COVID. About 20 minutes from here is a treatment center called Sonnet Lake. I help do a group there on Tuesdays or Wednesdays at 2. And my home group sponsors a meeting in there on Sundays that I attend. So I've been going places I don't want to end up my whole life. And it's ultimately the grassroots and the meat of my recovery. I got a strong free legacy home group I'm a part of, but that's really the meat and potatoes of my life and what's really led to the life I have. So I'll close with this. On page 152 of our big book, the member asks this question, and it's a fair question. The question is this: do you have a sufficient substitute for king alcohol? And the book responds with yes, and it's vastly more than that. It's a fellowship in Alcoholics Anonymous, and the word fellowship is in the verb form, meaning I have to participate in my own sobriety. But if I come all the way in, sit all the way down, and stay, that my imagination is going to be fired. I'm going to make some lifelong friends, which is witnessed right here today is proof of that. But the most satisfactory years of my existence lie ahead. And man, I just can't tell you how true that is. That's not just good news. That's the best news ever, but it's true. It's ultimately my life. And but most importantly, it says this. I'm paraphrasing, but from 152 over to the top of 153, it says this: you're going to have the privilege to walk shoulder to shoulder with other people and help them rediscover life. And if you do that long enough, you're going to finally know what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. And friends, that shift from going from a taker to a giver is what this thing's all about. And man, it's a powerful transition, but we got to get the channel unclogged for that to happen. I didn't have the ability to love myself when I got here, or you, but due to this agape, unconditional love that happens in our fellowship, just let me come in with all my doubts, questions, hurts, habits, hangups, brokenness, all the stuff. You just let me come in. You help me love me until I could eventually love myself, but more importantly, learn to start loving you. And when that shift happens, it's the greatest way to live, and I wouldn't trade it for anything else in the world. So I close with this. My mom along, my mother, in 2013, I said, Mom, it's Mother's Day on Sunday. I want you to come to church with me. I'm giving the message that day. The lead pastor asked me to give the message, so I think it'd be cool if you come to church. Well, she was a diehard Catholic. I was in a Protestant church, but she agreed. I said, we'll go to brunch afterwards. It'll be awesome. So we get to church. He's sitting in the very front row, and the Pastor Keith was his name, starts the service. He comes out with 2 plants. Didn't know this was happening. He said, I got 2 plants to give out to 2 amazing women. The first one is to this woman who's been in church since Moses parted the Red Sea, whatever her name was. And everybody clapped, and they gave her this plant. He says, the second plant I want to give out is to Mama Long. That's what everybody called my mom. He said, because Mama Long, we want to thank you for everything you've done in this young man's life. He's been a blessing to us and countless others, and we're just forever grateful and indebted to you and your example in his life. And they walked down and they handed her the plant, and then they handed her the microphone. And I'll never forget what she said. She took the microphone, and this is all she said: don't thank me for that boy's life. Thank Alcoholics Anonymous. And she handed the microphone back. And I said, well, great, Mom, you just broke my anonymity in front of 500 people. And we had a big laugh on it. But it's really the truth. That's all the evidence you need to know of what this demonstration meant to my family and it means to me. So thank you, Glenn, for letting me come and being a part of the lunch bunch, or whatever you call yourselves, and to share my experience, strength, and hope. Thank you for that time. But more importantly, thank you for my life. And that's all I got.